All right, good morning. As Grant said, ATR has done a little bit of work recently on the carbon tax, and Dr. Zeiker previewed a couple of the things going on right now across the country. But previewing kind of my remarks for today, I'll touch on a couple of things that are going on both in DC and across the country relevant to the carbon tax. But then I want to touch a little bit more on why this is both a policy disaster with extremely negative consequences to consumers and businesses, but also the political consequences. The fact that in many cases what we are seeing is that support for a carbon tax, not only in the United States but around the world, is political suicide. That this is a horrible idea for conservatives and a horrible idea for folks who both want to get elected or stay elected. And as such, I've kind of deemed it a modern-day IQ test for conservatives, both because of the risks associated with growing government, what we have seen when we've gone down this path in other circumstances, but certainly from a political perspective as well. So previewing again what's happening right now. Of course, no state in the United States has imposed a carbon tax to date. There have been a number of resolutions, a couple of localities, and ballot initiatives, but again, no state to date in the United States has imposed a carbon tax. On top of the bill introduced by Republican Carlos Curbelo of Southern Florida, there also was a recent vote that I think is worth mentioning with near universal support from Republicans in the House of Representatives expressing opposition to a carbon tax, and that was Congressman Steve Scalise and Congressman McKinley of West Virginia's resolution that passed 229 to 180, again, expressing the sentiment of the House of Representatives that a carbon tax would be destructive and impose negative economic consequences in the United States. Additionally, and I won't go too into details on the Climate Leadership Council, but certainly there are a significant number of Washington's swamp creatures pushing a wide variety of carbon taxes, ranging anywhere from the $24 a ton to a $40 a ton. I'm sure that'll continue to vary and grow as they don't realize any success with the movement, but there are a lot of proposals out there. The final issue worth mentioning with regards to what's going on right now is that there is another stab at imposing a state carbon tax in Washington state this year. That ballot initiative is pending this November. Again, we've already addressed some of the plans that are out there, but a couple of things that I want to mention are just how big the Baker-Schultz plan is in terms of revenue, tax increases, and the amount of spending and government growth involved. Estimates range from $2 to $3 trillion in tax increases over a 10-year basis for the $40 a ton carbon tax. And again, this is what it starts at. It is indexed to inflation plus 2% as well, so it grows in perpetuity. This is a larger welfare and entitlements program than Obamacare by a factor of 3. It is a significant growth of government designed not to be revenue neutral, but to grow government permanently to a very significant degree. It's also worth mentioning because this is something that hasn't been discussed a lot in the last year and a half as a result of the political reality in Washington, D.C., but a lot of folks pushing a carbon tax, including Carlos Curbelo, have argued that this is how we get the American political left and environmentalists to the table to rein in some of their regulatory assaults on the energy sector in the name of environmentalism. What they argue is that we can pair a disastrous tax with a reining in of regulations, which would be great, and that's how we get a grand compromise. It's worth mentioning that we are getting all of the regulatory relief currently without the need for any sort of destructive tax or regulatory discussions. And so for those that said in the lead up to the 2016 presidential election, this is what we have to do, I suggest that what we have to do is win elections, and we can continue our deregulation approach, certainly under the leadership of former Administrator Scott Pruitt, under a lot of what's going on in the Department of Interior, wide range of opportunities to continue deregulation. So that's kind of a silly discussion. And of course, the Carlos Curbelo plan includes a gas tax trade-off. There are plans that include no trade-off at all, like in Washington state. So the carbon tax is what they want. They're going to throw a lot of things at the wall to try to see what sticks. Nothing has so far, but certainly a lot of things in the works. So the carbon tax is a massive new tax on 80% at a minimum of the energy that we currently consume: coal, oil, natural gas. It hits energy. This is why it has an impact both on gas prices, on utility bills, on everyday consumer goods. It is extremely regressive. It harms retirees, low-income individuals, certainly urban individuals who take public transit or rail, the sort of political constituencies that the American political left pretends to care about. Families, small businesses, there is no one not touched or harmed by a carbon tax, but certainly there are manufacturers or refiners or certain industries that are not only harmed but put out of business as a result of this tax, making it bad policy. And again, on the gas tax front alone, the policies range from resulting in a 5 to 36 cents per gallon increase in the cost of gas on a federal carbon tax alone. It also involves significant government growth. There is no way to impose a 2 or 3 or even $1 trillion tax increase that is targeted to a specific set of industries. In Curbello's bill, for example, they outline 18 different industries, but give the EPA the ability to come up with additional ones in the future, which is sounds like a great idea. It obviously would require a significant new number of individuals to impose the tax. New IRS agents tasked with overseeing a massive expansion of energy taxation from coal mines to refineries and various manufacturers. But it would also require more EPA bureaucrats. The trustworthy folks who roam the halls of the EPA under a Democrat administration would be empowered to not only come up with an expanded list of industries to hit if carbon reduction or carbon emission reduction goals are not met, but they'll be there to police and oversee the environmental impact as well. And of course, as we saw with Obamacare, and as is the case with any new massive government program, there will be dozens of new federal departments and agencies. If you remember back to the Obamacare, a lot of the messaging in 2010, I don't know if anyone ever saw that chart of all of the different departments and agencies and the hundreds of little pathways that existed and where money went to spend it on things. Well, with a program 2 to 3 times bigger than that, that's the sort of red tape and bureaucracy and absurdity we would see just to oversee this idea. So Rupert Darwall, NRO, put it really well in regards to how market distortion is rarely, if ever, conservative. And he explained that government created market distortion that discourages the efficient use of hydrocarbon energy, shrinks the economy's productivity frontier, its potential output at the current state of best practice, and subverts consumer choice. Again, this is not a conservative idea. Anyone who argues that this is either a market solution or conservative in any way is abandoning the basic tenets of conservatism when it comes to consumer choice and business decisions and entrepreneurship. This is the heavy hand of government controlling the decisions that we make on a daily basis while significantly increasing costs. Anyone who tells you it is a conservative has an alternate agenda, but is certainly lying to you. There's also a lot of fake populism involved here. What they try to do is appeal to our sense of saving others with lofty and interesting rhetoric about rising seas and tidal communities. But it's certainly interesting to take a look at the fact that a carbon tax that significantly increased costs, the Curbello bill, $688 for the average family of 4, and utility cost increases alone, imposes immediate harm today so that, again, we can sing Kumbaya in 200 years if temperatures decline by 0.5%. And so the cost of reducing greenhouse gas emissions are borne by Americans, while the overwhelmingly articulated benefits in terms of reduced climate impacts occur mostly to generations yet to be born in developing nations. So going back to the point of certainly haven't heard a lot about this since 2016, but this argument that it is possible to get revenue neutral, that it is possible or there is even an appetite for doing something like reducing the corporate tax rate in exchange for a higher carbon tax. Washington State Ballot Initiative proved that certainly was not of interest to the American political left, but also progressive activists and politicians have no real interest in environmental policy reform that does not grow the size of government. The parasites that comprise the American political left need more money to spend on their interest, whether it's in the name of pollution control or whatever the favored policy is of the day. And again, State Initiative 732 in Washington State was a good example of this, because those pushing the carbon tax in 2016 in Washington State argued that it was revenue neutral. At the time, it was a $15 per ton tax, raising to $100 a ton over time. But the Sierra Club opposed it because it was paired with a reduction in the gross receipts tax and a sales tax cut. It wasn't actually revenue neutral because they created a earned income tax credit in a state that doesn't have an income tax, so it was simply a welfare payment. But this initiative was defeated by Washington State voters, 41 to 59. And again, revenue neutral. This is not simply a cut or an increase. This is revenue neutral. Voters said no thanks by a significant margin. A carbon tax, for all the reasons we've discussed as being bad policy, is also horrible politically. Fired Congressman Bob Inglis is the first and best example of this. Ran in South Carolina, defeated in a primary, and now pushing the carbon tax, not learning his lesson and cashing in. He was a big supporter of cap and trade, of course, resoundingly defeated as a result of his support for that national energy scheme. But it's also worth looking at a more recent example. In 2016, Governor Phil Scott in Vermont. Vermont, for those who pay attention to national politics or maybe from there, you may know that Vermont is not a red state. This is Bernie Sanders' backyard. This is a state that Donald Trump only got 30.3% of the vote in 2016. But Governor Phil Scott ran against a Democrat by the name of Sue Minter, and he opposed the carbon tax. She pushed the carbon tax. It became a defining political issue of that campaign in 2016, and in a state that Donald Trump lost by a margin of 56 to 30, Phil Scott won 52 to 43. In a blue state where the carbon tax was a defining issue of the campaign, a Republican won. It's also worth looking at some international examples. In Australia, they imposed a carbon tax in 2012. It was such a political disaster that not only after a series of political defeats, but further consideration, they entirely repealed their carbon tax just 2 years later. There's also a carbon tax civil war going on in Canada right now. June 7th, defeat of Liberal Ontario Premier Kathleen Wynne, lost to Conservative Doug Ford. The name should ring a bell. Family member. There are a number of provinces that are suing over the carbon tax, which may define the 2019 elections in Canada. And so it's unpopular not only in the United States, where we have a series of initiative and electoral examples, but internationally, where they have either considered, contemplated it, or passed it. There have been negative political consequences for those who have gone down this course as well. It's also worth, again, looking at the political reality of where we are at in the United States today. We control the executive branch, the federal legislative branch. We're going to get another Supreme Court nominee and more wins on environmental cases. We control most states, 26 outright, split control of 16 states. Democrats only control 6. We are compromising against ourselves to suggest that any of the sort of regulatory or tax trade-offs that the left says that they're willing to concede, whether it's rate cuts on corporate or rate cuts on income, or deregulation in general, those are all things that we are achieving without the imposition of a new massive tax on energy. Of course, they're going to continue to go down this route and suggest that there is some sort of conservatism involved in the imposition of this new national tax. They argue things, but when they argue this, it's interesting to look at some of the things they also say, that it would level the playing field for energy sources like nuclear, wind, solar, and hydro. Of course, wind and solar are not competitive in a market, and so they have to raise costs on 80% of energy in order to achieve those things. But they also admit that they want to impose carbon taxes at the state level. Eli Lair of our street argued that the EPA should allow flexibility in the states to impose their own carbon taxes, and so this is not conservative at all. In fact, there is no conservative case for a carbon tax in any circumstances. It ignores Republican dominance throughout the country. It disregards a lack of interest by Democrats in deregulation. It capitulates to solve a problem by raising energy costs on those who can least afford it. It's also worth looking at the fact that there isn't even a Democrat political constituency on this issue. When Hillary Clinton's campaign looked at it in 2016, campaign manager Robbie Mook said, to be clear, it's lethal in the general. I don't want to support one. But even my favorite quote, the one that we displayed at Carlos Curbello's event, John Podesta, Center for American Progress campaign chairman, the one that came out on the stage to bloviate on the night that she lost to Donald Trump because she refused to face the crowd, he said, "We've done extensive polling on the carbon tax, and it all sucks." So I will end with this. There is no interest at the federal level in a carbon tax. When the mainstream press and those pushing it wanted President Trump to be tricked into supporting it as a part of federal tax reform or anything else, he took to Twitter to set the facts straight. There is not an interest at that level. And I will end with an image. Going back to my point about Obamacare, a carbon tax is Obamacare on heroin. It is appealing to those addicted to significant sums of government revenue and government growth, but it is harmful to consumers, to low-income individuals, to families, to businesses, to a broad range of political constituencies and a broad range of diverse folks from various backgrounds. And it is one of several very bad ways to harm your personal, political, and professional health. It is best to avoid experimentation. Thank you.